This is a broadcast from the American Radio Authority. The following report has been verified through pattern recognition, environmental repetition, and public exposure events too consistent to dismiss. For decades, citizens have been instructed to interpret seasonal atmospheric irritation as harmless byproduct of plant reproduction, a natural cycle, a routine inconvenience, an unfortunate but necessary expression of spring. Yet, each year, the same substance returns with remarkable precision. It appears everywhere at once, on vehicles, on sidewalks, on porches, on windows, on outdoor furniture no one has touched in days. It settles into the seams of daily life with the quiet confidence of something that expects to be there. The substance is called pollen. This is the accepted term, not necessarily the complete one. Citizens are told that this material originates from trees, grasses, and flowering plants, that it is released for reproductive purposes, that the wind carries it where it may. This explanation is sufficient for children. It becomes less sufficient in adulthood, because adulthood notices things. Adulthood notices that the volume often appears disproportionate to the visible plant activity in a given area. It notices that the coating reaches places that do not seem logically exposed. It notices that the arrival is not random, but organized, sweeping through regions in waves, often independent on the average person's ability to identify a single immediate source. And most importantly, adulthood notices the body's response. The human body does not welcome this material. Eyes inflame, sinuses flood, breathing patterns shift, skin reacts, energy declines, thought becomes fogged, mood changes, pressure builds behind the face as though the body is attempting to reject, flush, or isolate an intrusive presence. This is the important distinction. The body does not behave as though it is encountering something neutral. It behaves as though it is negotiating with something foreign. We are told this is sensitivity, an overreaction, an unfortunate immune misunderstanding. But one must ask, why is the burden of misunderstanding always assigned to the body and never to the material? At what point does repeated biological resistance stop being called inconvenience and start being recognized as evidence? Some independent observers have proposed that what we call pollen may represent more than plant residue, not necessarily an artificial substance, not necessarily a weaponized one, but perhaps a carrier medium, a transfer layer, a particulate system designed not merely to spread across terrain, but to induce compatibility. Note the wording carefully. Compatibility. Not infection, not conquest, not even contamination in the conventional sense. Compatibility suggests preparation, adjustment, the gradual reduction of friction between one environment and another. The possibility becomes harder to ignore when one considers the long pattern of exposure. Not once, not suddenly, not in catastrophic doses, but seasonally, repeatedly, patiently. Enough to irritate, enough to provoke, never enough to force a unified response. This is not how one behaves when trying to destroy a host population. It is, however, how one behaves when trying to familiarize the population with a presence it would otherwise resist. Initial exposure produces distress, repeated exposure produces tolerance, and after sufficient cycles, the population begins doing something very interesting. It adjusts its life around the event. Medication is purchased, windows are closed, vehicles are rinsed, outdoor time is modified, children are kept inside, forecasts are checked, warnings are issued, entire industries emerge, not to stop the phenomenon, but to help citizens survive it. Observe the elegance of that. The event does not need to be hidden, it only needs to be normalized. Once normalized, it no longer inspires investigation, it inspires management. And a managed population is far easier to condition than an alarmed one. There are, of course, official objections. Botanical institutions maintain that the material is entirely terrestrial. Environmental authorities insist that the spread is both natural and expected. Medical professionals continue to frame the body's rejection as a seasonal burden to be endured, not a signal to be interpreted. That is their role. Our role is to notice what remains inconveniently consistent. Why does the event feel coordinated? Why does the body behave as though it recognizes intrusion before the mind does? Why are exposure systems so widespread, so repeatable, and so strangely accepted for something described as ordinary? And why? After all this time, does the explanation still sound more like a placeholder than a conclusion? The American Radio Authority is not stating that this atmosphere contains off-world biology. We are not stating that the annual particulate cycle represents direct seeding by an external intelligence. We are not stating that the population is being gradually acclimated to a presence whose full integration would be rejected if introduced all at once. We are simply stating that if a process were underway, it would likely resemble something very close to this: a slow particulate adjustment, a recurring biological negotiation, An environmental merger introduced in small doses, small enough to be mocked, dismissed, or sold over the counter. Not an arrival, an adaptation. Not first contact, pre-contact compatibility. Not proof of occupation, proof that the body may, in certain seasons, be responding to more than trees. And if that idea sounds absurd, we encourage listeners to remember how often absurdity has later been reclassified as early observation. The material will return, it always does, on schedule, across distance, in quantities few people question and fewer still truly examine. You may call it spring, you may call it allergy season, you may call it nature, but the body may already be calling it something else. This has been a report from the American Radio Authority. Exposure remains ongoing, interpretation remains voluntary.